Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are looking at 2 Kings 5 to 8. There's some more prophet stories that might have come out of your childhood storybook Bible, if you had one. These are popular stories like Naaman getting healed of leprosy, axe heads floating. I guess that's the big ones. There's the army of the Lord that becomes visible to the Syrians. I've heard that one before. So there's some pretty interesting stories in here. It's definitely worth a read. As we're reading over these things, Jenny, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, I think it's safe to say that there's definitely some repeat in the second part of the reading today. So, like, there are some things that we have already heard of before, but some things that do stick out for sure is, like, there's so much, like, hunger going on where people are, like, willing to pay astronomical amounts of money for, like, really disgusting things to eat. For instance, in here, I believe is it chapter
6.
Is it 6?
Yep. You're probably talking chapter 6, verse 25. And there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver and the fourth part of a cob of a dove's dung for 5 shekels.
So disgusting. So, like, at first it's like, what are they even talking about? But there's, like, this famine that's going on, and people have absolutely nothing to eat. And I think you mentioned earlier, way back when we had read before, was it like, I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. Was it like almost like prophesying about how, like, children will be eaten by their families?
Leviticus 26:29 says, "You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters, and I will destroy your high places and cut down your incense altars and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols, and my soul will abhor you."
Dang, that is crazy.
This is like all the way back in Leviticus where it's talking about blessings for following the Lord and curses for turning against the Lord.
So there's, like, this serious famine, and the reason that I'm even talking about that is because not only are they, like, selling really disgusting things for a lot of money, there are also women who are, like, they're so hungry that they, like, boil their children and eat them. Like, so disgusting. So it's definitely a callback to what we've heard of before. There's also a huge famine going on with these people. It's really gross. It's really awful. But then Elisha comes in, and what's really crazy is he prophesies about food. So he's like, well, tomorrow, like, you're spending all this money on nasty stuff, and, like, really horrible things. But he says, tomorrow at the same time, this is chapter 7 now, you're going to be selling flour, a seah. I'm not sure what that would mean. I'm sure it's probably something small, but a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, just one, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, just one, at the gate of Samaria. So, like, these people are, like, have absolutely nothing. Is like, oh, well, tomorrow that's totally going to change. And sure enough, like, these random men go into,
it's like the Syrian camp.
yes, and they find all this food because the Lord had actually, like, scared the Syrians out of their camp. So they were able to actually have food again, which is crazy.
Elisha also had warned the Shunammite woman who he raised her son from the dead. He had warned her that this famine was coming. Mm-hmm. And so he actually told her to leave, like, get out of here, go somewhere else. And she leaves and comes back at the conclusion of this time, and the king restores to her all the things that she had walked away from because of Elisha. So in these couple of chapters, you can see kind of this degradation of Israel's partnership with Syria. They start out with kind of this loose, very, like, fragile alliance, and we saw some of that in the past where the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah were going together with the kings of Syria for war. So if you look at chapter 5, Naaman is an officer of the Syrian army who has leprosy and is sent to the man of God in Israel.
Isn't that Well, go ahead. Just go ahead and finish.
Well, and so he goes to the king of Israel first, and the king of Israel is afraid. And the reason he's afraid is because they have this really uneasy peace treaty, and he doesn't want to upset this Syrian officer because he can't heal him. And so the officer then goes to Elisha, and Elisha has him take a bath in the Jordan, which he would have thought was disgusting. And he's healed of his leprosy, and so he chooses to worship only the Lord. So in these couple of chapters, some that we read yesterday, some that we're reading today, there is kind of this regular recognition of the fact that people who are outside of Israel are honoring God with their lives. Even the king of Syria, when he has questions, sends his messengers in to speak with Elisha, who would be a prophet of his enemy nation, because they have such high regard for God. So if you just consider how much this is all being flipped on its head, because the Israelites are rebelling against God, they hate God, and the Syrians are intrigued by God because they recognize his power, his grace, his mercy, his foresight, his ability to care for people. So in these stories, oftentimes you have foreigners that love the Lord and people from Israel who hate the Lord. So it's kind of bizarre. It's another one of those times where I'm reminded of how similar to Judges this is.
Well, I was going to say that it seems to me like there's a pretty clear across-the-board message with most of these things going on. So what you had talked about in chapter 5, and then we come back over here to chapter 6 where it's talking about people coming to Elijah specifically actually, I guess that would be chapter 7 where he's talking about God told me this is going to happen with all of the food. And then in chapter 8, he's talking about, where is it? Is it Hazael? Hazael murders?
Yeah.
Okay. So he murders Ben-Hadad because Elisha says, I know you're going to be the king of Israel, or the king of Syria. And he's actually really torn up about it because you're going to kill a lot of Israelite people and you're really going to do terrible things. And sure enough, that's what he does. But I think what's really interesting after all of this, all these things, after all it's said and done, all of these seemingly wicked people, they always come to the person who is a representative of God. So they're always drawn back, not necessarily to that person, but because they know that God is working through them. They are attracted to the God of the universe. So I think that's super telling, because that is very much what we do in today's day and age too. When everything falls down to the wayside, when everything is stripped away and all insecurities are just laid bare, what do? The first thing is we got to pray. We got to pray to God that this is all going to get better. We got to do X, Y, Z because God's going to help us through this. We resort back to when there's nothing left, we resort back to that. So I think that's really interesting. For these people, the people that had leprosy, all these crazy situations are oh, well, go talk to that guy because he knows God and that God can do something about it. So I think that's really interesting. It's a huge parallel to how we, I feel deal today too.
When you want to find genuine power and genuine authority, the only place you can turn is to the Lord. Mm-hmm. Everything else is a counterfeit. And so in these stories, you see even the Syrians, they're not interested in going to their gods because they know their gods are pretend and they have no power. They have no authority. Mm-hmm. But God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not always the God of Israel, unfortunately, he has power and authority. He has might. And the men of God, here we see Elisha. Prior to this, we saw Elijah. They are tapped into who he is. They're tapped into the power that he has. They are obedient to him. They are representing him. And God is rewarding that. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting. This is one of those moments where I say, if you have this idea that God is, racist or nationalistic or whatever, and that the Old Testament proves that God only cares about Israel, that is so wrong. Because here we actually see passages where God is deeply concerned about Syrian people from an enemy nation, and he shows them grace and he shows them mercy. We also could make the case that here God is afflicting his chosen people, Israel. And I hesitate to say his chosen people because God's chosen people are the ones that are obedient to him. He is, I don't want to mix this up. Like, he is faithful to his promises. And the text even calls out that he is faithful to his promise to David. And he's not going to go back on the fact that he promised David an enduring line of kings. But ultimately, like, God is faithful to the people who are obedient to him. And the reason I like explaining it that way is because that hasn't changed. Like, God didn't hit the New Testament and just change his mind. God has always been welcoming of anyone who will serve him and be obedient to him. So we see Egyptians leaving Egypt with the Israelites in the Exodus. We see here today Syrians who are being healed of their leprosy because they're being obedient to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see today, like, Gentiles all over the world, tons of people that are Christians don't have any, Israeli or Jewish background, and God is faithful to them because they're obedient to him. Like the New Testament says, we are grafted in, we're adopted as sons and daughters of the King. God's heart for obedience is so obvious in these passages. And his punishment for disobedience, like you see Gehazi. Gehazi is Elisha's servant, and Elisha heals this dude of leprosy, and Gehazi's first thought is like, oh, I could make some money off of that. And God's like, hey, you know what? You're going to have leprosy and your descendants are going to have leprosy because you are not supposed to be making cash off of the things that I'm doing graciously for other people. And so I think today, even into today, you see churches that are
Well, he lied about it too.
He lied about it, but he also was just like taking advantage of God's grace. And you see today churches that really struggle with taking advantage of God's grace, where there are things that we should be offering as a free gift, but somehow we set up like really odd paywalls and people of God get distracted by money and power and possessions. So as far as the your part goes, man, continue to be obedient to God today. I know that's not super deep or super powerful, but be obedient to the Lord and he will reward you for that. He'll be faithful to you. We'll be back again tomorrow. Tomorrow we're diving into 2 Kings 9. We'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.